A billionaire fell in love with a driver who was secretly a princess. But on the very day they stood at the altar, their wedding came to a shocking halt when an elderly decorated general walked into the cathedral. Every royal guard dropped to one knee before the bride, and the groom realized the woman he loved had never told him who she really was. The billionaire, Ethan Blackwood, had built an empire worth billions, but the one thing money could never buy was someone who loved him for the man behind the fortune. Then he met Clara Morgan, the quiet, humble driver who never asked for special treatment, never cared about his wealth, and whose kindness changed lives wherever she went. But behind her simple uniform was a secret powerful enough to shake kingdoms, destroy old lies, and rewrite everything Ethan believed about love. As the stunned guests watched in silence, Clara lowered her head before the elderly general, not as a frightened bride, but as someone honoring a duty she could no longer hide. Ethan could only stare, wondering how the woman who had once driven him through city streets could command the respect of an entire royal guard. But if Clara was truly a princess, why had she chosen to live as an ordinary driver? Why had she hidden her identity from the man she was about to marry? And why did the old general carry a sealed folder that seemed important enough to stop the wedding itself? What Ethan didn't know was that this wedding wasn't just about a billionaire marrying a driver who was secretly a princess. It was about to expose a 30-year-old secret that someone had killed to keep buried. And before the vows could be spoken, every life inside that cathedral would change forever. The soaring stained glass windows of St. Alban Cathedral scattered ribbons of colored light across polished marble floors as hundreds of distinguished guests sat in breathless anticipation. Cabinet ministers, ambassadors, business magnates, philanthropists, and foreign dignitaries filled every pew. Outside, satellite vans from international news networks stretched for blocks, broadcasting what the world believed would be the wedding of the year. At the altar stood Ethan Blackwood. At just 38, Ethan had transformed Blackwood Mobility from a struggling family transport company into one of Europe's most influential electric mobility corporations. Financial magazines regularly listed his fortune among the continent's largest, yet those who knew him best often remarked that success had never erased the sadness behind his eyes. He wore an impeccably tailored black tuxedo, but unlike many billionaires who surrounded themselves with extravagance, there wasn't a trace of arrogance in his posture. He glanced toward the cathedral doors, unable to suppress a smile. "I've negotiated billion-pound deals without breaking a sweat," he whispered to his best man, Daniel. Daniel chuckled, "And today?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Today feels much harder." Laughter briefly eased the tension. Few people knew that beneath Ethan's composed exterior lived a man who had spent nearly 20 years carrying unanswered questions about his father's death. Official investigators had ruled it a tragic brake failure on a mountain road, but Ethan had never completely believed the report. As a young man standing beside his father's coffin, he had noticed Marcus Hale, the family friend everyone admired, place a comforting hand on his shoulder and quietly say, "Some questions only destroy the people asking them." At the time, grief had silenced Ethan. Years later, those words would echo with a far darker meaning. Not far from the altar, Marcus Hale watched everything unfold with practiced calm. Now chairman of Blackwood Holdings, Marcus carried himself with effortless authority. His silver hair, tailored suit, and reassuring smile had earned him the trust of politicians and investors alike. To the public, he was the loyal mentor who had helped guide Ethan after his father's death. Only Marcus knew how much depended on this wedding ending before certain truths resurfaced. His gaze drifted briefly toward the cathedral entrance before returning to Ethan. Almost imperceptibly, his fingers tightened around his walking cane. It was such a small movement that no one noticed. But it revealed a fear he had spent decades hiding. Meanwhile, hidden behind towering oak doors, Clara Morgan adjusted the delicate sleeves of her wedding gown. Unlike Ethan's lavish lifestyle, Clara had always appeared content with simplicity. She had once rented a modest flat overlooking a quiet neighborhood, drove whatever company vehicle was assigned to her, and treated every cleaner, receptionist, and security guard with the same respect she showed senior executives. Even after becoming engaged to one of the richest men in Europe, she had resisted designer labels, insisting that kindness was more valuable than appearances. Her bridesmaid, Olivia Grant, gently squeezed her hand. "You still have time to run," Olivia teased. Clara laughed softly. "If I run, he'll probably chase me." "He definitely would." Their shared smile quickly faded as Clara looked toward a small velvet pouch resting on the dressing table. Inside lay an old silver crest engraved with a crowned falcon. She reached toward it. then stopped. For a fleeting second, a memory crossed her mind. Not words. Not faces. Just the distant sound of trumpets echoing through enormous palace corridors, while a little girl in polished shoes walked alone beneath towering ceilings, her tiny footsteps swallowed by marble halls much too large for a child. At the end of that corridor waited an elderly woman wearing a crown, kneeling instead of standing, so she could embrace the frightened little girl at eye level. The warmth of that embrace lingered even after the memory faded. Clara closed the pouch without opening it. Not today, she whispered to herself. Olivia frowned. What was that? Just nerves. It wasn't entirely true. Across the cathedral courtyard, members of the Royal Ceremonial Guard quietly took positions outside. They wore no banners, displayed no flags. Their presence had been arranged with extraordinary discretion days earlier through sealed diplomatic channels. Ordinary guests assumed they were additional security hired for such a high-profile event. No one questioned why their uniforms bore the insignia of the Kingdom of Alderheim. No one except one elderly man walking slowly toward the cathedral doors. General Arthur Hastings. His military decorations reflected decades of distinguished service protecting a royal family whose greatest secret rested inside the worn leather folder beneath his arm. 30 years earlier, he had promised himself that the truth would someday reach the people who deserved it. For 30 years, he had failed. Now age had bent his back, illness weakened his body, and doctors had quietly told him his remaining time was measured in months rather than years. He refused to die carrying another man's burden. Inside the folder rested faded photographs, forgotten investigation reports, witness statements, and one handwritten letter that had never reached its intended recipient. As Arthur climbed the cathedral steps, he looked skyward. "Forgive me," he murmured. "I should have come sooner." Inside, the organ began to play. The massive doors opened. Every guest rose to their feet. Clara appeared at the end of the aisle, breathtaking in ivory silk, her calm smile hiding a lifetime of carefully guarded secrets. Ethan's eyes filled with quiet admiration. For him, she wasn't a princess. She wasn't a mystery. She was simply the woman who had taught him that genuine kindness was worth more than every company he owned. Neither of them realized that before they could exchange a single vow. The past had already arrived, 6 months earlier. Long before the royal guards knelt before Clara, before the sealed folder, before the wedding that would leave the world speechless, Ethan Blackwood believed he had everything except the one thing he wanted most. From the 42nd floor of Blackwood Mobility's headquarters, London stretched endlessly beneath him. His company was valued at over £18 billion, employing more than 80,000 people across Europe. Every morning, financial analysts tracked his decisions, investors chased his approval, and reporters speculated about his next billion-pound acquisition. Yet every evening, Ethan returned to a penthouse that felt painfully silent. His assistant knocked gently. "Mr. Blackwood, your 9 o'clock board meeting starts in 10 minutes. "I'm coming." As Ethan reached for a framed photograph on his desk, his expression softened. It showed him as a teenager beside his father, William Blackwood, both smiling beside an old vintage sports car. A familiar memory surfaced. 19 years earlier, a police officer had placed a hand on 17-year-old Ethan's shoulder outside a wrecked mountain road. "I'm sorry, your father's brakes failed." Everyone accepted it as an accident. Everyone except Ethan. The memory dissolved as another knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus Hale entered with his usual reassuring smile. "Still thinking about him?" "Some days never end," Ethan admitted. Marcus rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. "William wouldn't want you trapped in the past, focus on the future." Ethan nodded, but Marcus's words left a strange emptiness behind. Moments later, HR Director Susan Ellis stepped into the office. "Sir, your executive driver has been admitted to hospital. He'll be away for several months." Ethan sighed. "I hope he recovers. We've found a temporary replacement. Her credentials are exceptional." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Exceptional." Susan opened a file. "Advanced Executive Driving Certification, Emergency Medical Training, fluent in 5 languages, Defensive Security Driving." Marcus frowned. Why would someone with those qualifications choose to become a chauffeur? No one answered. Outside the office window, a sleek black executive sedan pulled quietly into the courtyard below. Behind the steering wheel sat Clara Morgan, unaware that stepping out of that car was about to change both their lives forever. The lift door slid open with a quiet chime as Ethan Blackwood stepped into the underground garage, fastening the cuff of his navy suit while scanning the day's schedule on his tablet. 3 investor meetings, a government transport summit, and a charity luncheon filled every hour until evening. It was the kind of day that had built his fortune and quietly consumed his life. A polished black executive sedan waited near the entrance. Standing beside it was a woman in a tailored charcoal driver's uniform. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Instead, she was inspecting the tires with calm concentration. As Ethan approached, she closed the inspection log and offered a respectful smile. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. I'm Clara Morgan. I'll be your driver until Mr. Harris recovers." Her voice was warm, steady, and surprisingly confident. Ethan extended his hand. "Thank you for stepping in." She shook it firmly, not timidly, yet never overstepping professional boundaries. Before opening the rear door, Clara paused. "Would you mind sitting in the front today?" Ethan looked at her puzzled. "The front?" "Yes, sir. Your rear left tire has lost a little pressure overnight. It's still safe, but until it's replaced, the front seat will give you the smoothest ride." Ethan frowned. "You can tell that without driving. I noticed the sidewall settling slightly lower while I was inspecting the vehicle." Curious, Ethan crouched beside the tire. She was right. It wasn't dangerous, but it had lost enough air to affect the balance. A mechanic confirmed it moments later. "You've got sharp eyes," Ethan said as he stood. Clara smiled modestly. "I was trained never to ignore small details. Sometimes they're the only warning you get." The words lingered in Ethan's mind as they drove out of the garage. Unknown to him, they carried a deeper truth than either of them realized. Years earlier, a teenage Clara had stood beside her father inside a private royal training ground. He had rested a hand on her shoulder and pointed to a row of official vehicles. "A good driver doesn't wait for danger," he had told her. "They notice what everyone else overlooks." The memory faded as quickly as it came. Clara tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She never spoke about those lessons anymore. Halfway through the journey, traffic suddenly slowed. A cyclist had fallen at a busy junction. Without hesitation, Clara eased off the accelerator, leaving extra space instead of forcing the car through the congestion like the other impatient drivers. Most motorists blasted their horns. Clara simply waited. Ethan noticed. "You seem unusually patient." She kept her eyes on the road. "My father used to say that arriving 1 minute later is better than making someone never arrive at all." Again, she offered no explanation. Ethan glanced at her reflection in the mirror. There was something different about this woman. Not because of her skill. Not because of her composure. But because every answer she gave hinted at a life she carefully refused to describe. As they arrived at headquarters, Ethan stepped from the car and watched Clara quietly thank the parking attendant by name. The elderly attendant smiled as though she had brightened his entire morning. Ethan found himself wondering one simple question. Who had taught an ordinary driver to carry herself with such quiet grace? 3 weeks passed, and Clara Morgan settled naturally into Ethan Blackwood's daily routine. Every morning, the black executive sedan waited outside Blackwood Mobility headquarters before sunrise. Every route was planned with military precision, every vehicle inspected twice, and every destination reached on time. Yet what surprised Ethan most wasn't Clara's professionalism. It was the quiet kindness she showed to people no one else seemed to notice. She greeted every security guard by name. She remembered the receptionist's birthday. She never drove past the elderly newspaper vendor without asking how his arthritis was improving. One Monday morning, Ethan climbed into the front passenger seat, carrying a folder containing documents for the biggest shareholders' meeting of the year. "If this meeting goes well," he said, fastening his seat belt, "we'll secure a £2.3 billion expansion." Clara smiled. "Then I suppose we shouldn't be late." The city bustled with commuters as they crossed a busy market district. Suddenly, Clara eased off the accelerator. About 30 meters ahead, an elderly fruit seller collapsed beside his wooden cart. Bright oranges rolled across the pavement as pedestrians glanced over, then hurried past without stopping. Ethan instinctively checked his watch. "We're already running behind." Clara didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the unconscious man. Finally, she spoke softly. "Sir, if we leave him, he may not still be alive when the meeting ends." Without waiting for another word, she safely pulled the car to the curb, switched on the hazard lights, and hurried towards the old man. Her movements were calm, measured, almost instinctive. She checked his pulse, loosened his collar, placed him carefully into the recovery position. "You," she called to a nearby teenager, "please ring an ambulance." She turned to a shopkeeper. "Could you bring a bottle of water and keep everyone back so he has room to breathe?" People who moments earlier had frozen in uncertainty now followed her instructions without question. Ethan stood beside her, watching in astonishment. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Clara looked up briefly. "Someone once taught me that every life deserves the same urgency." She offered nothing more. What Ethan couldn't see was the memory flickering through her mind. Years earlier, 12-year-old Clara had walked beside Queen Eleanor through a royal hospital. She had watched doctors rush towards an injured minister while an elderly cleaner waited alone in pain. Confused, young Clara had looked at her grandmother. The Queen had knelt beside her and gently said, "Never measure a person's worth by their title. A crown means nothing if it teaches you to ignore ordinary people." The lesson had stayed with Clara long after she left the palace behind. The distant wail of an ambulance pulled her back to the present. As paramedics lifted the fruit seller onto a stretcher, one examined Clara's first aid. "You've done exactly the right things," he said with genuine admiration. "You may have saved his life." Clara simply nodded and stepped back. Ethan looked at his watch again. The shareholders' meeting had already begun without him. But for the first time in years, he realized he didn't regret being late. The boardroom fell silent the moment Ethan Blackwood walked through the doors. More than 40 shareholders sat around the polished oak table, their expressions ranging from irritation to disbelief. Several had flown in overnight from Germany, France, and Switzerland for what analysts had already labeled the company's most important meeting of the year. Marcus Hale glanced at the clock before forcing a polite smile. "Good of you to join us." The remark drew a few uncomfortable chuckles. Ethan calmly took his seat. "My apologies, someone needed help." One investor frowned. "I sincerely hope it was worth delaying a £2.3 billion expansion." Before Ethan could answer, Marcus smoothly stepped in. "Let's proceed. Mr. Blackwood has never missed a meeting before." Although the discussion continued, Ethan noticed Marcus studying him more than the financial reports. It lasted only a second. But something about that look felt unusually calculating. Outside the boardroom, Clara remained in the reception area, quietly reading while waiting for the meeting to end. She never attempted to explain her decision or defend herself. In her mind, saving a life required no justification. Late that afternoon, Ethan returned to the car carrying a small envelope. "I've got something you should see." Clara accepted it with curiosity. Inside was a handwritten letter decorated with uneven crayon flowers. "Dear Mr. Blackwood and the nice lady. Thank you for stopping to help my grandpa. The doctor said he would have died if nobody had helped him so quickly. I drew you a picture so you'll always remember him. Love, Emily." A folded drawing slipped onto Clara's lap. It showed an elderly fruit seller smiling from a hospital bed while Ethan and Clara stood beside him holding baskets of oranges. The proportions were clumsy, the colors wandered outside the lines, but the gratitude was unmistakable. Clara smiled warmly. "I hope he recovers completely." "So do I," Ethan replied. He hesitated before adding, "Do you know what bothered me most today?" She looked at him. "I almost asked you to drive past." Clara folded the drawing carefully. "But you didn't." "No." He stared through the windscreen. "I've spent years believing every minute had a price. You reminded me that sometimes the most valuable thing we can give someone is a few minutes of our time." For the first time since meeting her, Clara saw not the billionaire admired by magazines, but the lonely man behind the headlines. As they drove away, neither noticed Marcus watching from the office window high above. His expression was unreadable. He had already instructed someone to begin quietly investigating Ethan's new driver. Not because he distrusted her, because something about Clara Morgan felt dangerously familiar. And Marcus had learned long ago that forgotten faces often carried buried secrets. The following Sunday morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse overlooking the River Thames, London glowed beneath the soft light of dawn. Despite owning estates in Scotland, a villa in Italy and apartments in New York and Singapore, it was this quiet apartment that reminded him how empty success could feel. His phone buzzed. A calendar notification. 9:00 a.m. Charity Foundation Review. He dismissed it without opening the document. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Clara. Over the past month, she'd become more than his driver. She had become the calmest part of his hectic days, yet one small mystery continued to trouble him. Every Sunday, without fail, she disappeared for exactly 2 hours. She never volunteered an explanation. She simply requested the time off weeks in advance. It was the only part of her life she kept completely private. On Monday morning, Ethan climbed into the car. "Good morning, Clara." "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood." He smiled. "I've told you before, it's Ethan when we're not in meetings." She laughed softly. Old habits are difficult to break. As they joined the morning traffic, Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Clara looked at the road. "I'm listening." "Every Sunday you vanish for 2 hours." She smiled without looking at him. "I don't vanish. You know what I mean." "I do." "So where do you go?" For a brief moment, silence filled the car. Then she answered gently. "I made someone a promise a long time ago." "What kind of promise?" "One I intend to keep." She offered nothing more. Rather than sounding evasive, her voice carried quiet affection, as though the promise itself mattered more than explaining it. Ethan didn't press further. But curiosity settled deeper into his heart. Unknown to him, Clara wasn't spending those Sundays alone. Hidden behind the stone walls of St. Gabriel's Children's Hospice, she volunteered under her mother's maiden name. She read stories to terminally ill children. She drove families who couldn't afford transport. She cooked meals in the small community kitchen. No photographers. No social media. No publicity. Years earlier, while still living inside the royal palace of Alderheim, Queen Eleanor had often slipped away from official banquets to visit hospitals in secret. Young Clara had followed her one snowy evening, confused why a queen would leave a state dinner for a children's ward. "People remember the speeches," her grandmother had whispered while holding a sick child's hand, "but heaven remembers who stayed when everyone else went home." That lesson had become Clara's private tradition. Back in the present, Ethan noticed something else. As they stopped at a traffic light, several schoolchildren crossing the road recognized Clara. "Miss Clara," one little boy shouted, waving excitedly. She lowered the window. "Morning, Oliver, did you finish your science project?" The boy grinned proudly. "I got an A." "I knew you would." The traffic began moving again. Ethan looked at her with genuine surprise. "You seem to know children everywhere." Clara smiled, but her eyes remained on the road. "I suppose children remember people who remember them." Ethan leaned back in his seat, thoughtful. The more he learned about Clara, the less she seemed like an ordinary driver. Yet every answer she gave only deepened the mystery. And somewhere across the city, Marcus Hale's investigators had just uncovered the first clue hidden inside Clara Morgan's carefully constructed past. Marcus Hale had built his reputation on one simple belief: every secret leaves a trail. From the executive chairman's spacious office overlooking London's financial district, he studied the confidential file his private investigator had delivered that morning. The folder was unusually thin. That alone troubled him. Most background checks uncovered forgotten jobs, old addresses, university records, tax filings, or social media history. Clara Morgan's file contained almost nothing. The investigator shifted uneasily. I've never seen anything like this. Marcus slowly removed his reading glasses. What do you mean? We confirmed her driving license, employment history for the last few years, and executive transport certifications. Everything is legitimate. So what's the problem? The investigator slid another document across the desk. Everything before the age of 21 is sealed. Marcus's expression hardened. Sealed by whom? We don't know. You don't know, or you couldn't find out. The investigator hesitated. We received instructions to stop asking questions. Marcus leaned forward. Instructions from whom? There was no name. Only silence. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something unfamiliar. Unease. He dismissed the investigator, but instead of closing the folder, he stared at Clara's photograph. She looked ordinary. Too ordinary. People with perfectly ordinary lives didn't have records hidden behind invisible walls. Something was being protected. Or someone. Meanwhile, Ethan and Clara arrived at Blackwood Mobility's headquarters. As Clara handed the keys to the valet, Olivia Grant approached with a stack of documents. Morning, Clara. Morning, Olivia. Olivia smiled. I've been looking for you. For me. She held up a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. It arrived by courier. Clara's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Thank you. Olivia watched with quiet curiosity. Unlike ordinary letters, this one bore no postage stamp. Only an elegant falcon embossed into the wax. It looked centuries old. Family? Olivia asked casually. Clara nodded gently. Something like that. She slipped the letter into her handbag without opening it. Olivia said nothing. But the image stayed with her. Over the next few weeks, 2 more identical letters would arrive. Always handwritten. Always sealed. Always collected by Clara with the same calm expression. Tiny pieces of a much larger puzzle were quietly falling into place. That afternoon, Ethan found Clara standing beside the company garden during her lunch break. Instead of eating, she was helping the elderly groundskeeper replant flowers damaged by heavy winds. Her sleeves were rolled up. Dirt covered her hands. She laughed as the old man teased her about planting the flowers too close together. You'll make a gardener out of yourself yet, he joked. I've had good teachers, Clara replied. Ethan stood watching from a distance. She had no idea he was there. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. There were no cameras. No executives nearby. Only genuine kindness. For reasons he couldn't explain, Ethan smiled. His father had once told him, never judge people by how they treat important men, watch how they treat people who can do nothing for them. Standing there, he realized Clara passed that test without even knowing she was being observed. As she looked up and caught his eye, Ethan quickly pretended he'd only just arrived. Am I interrupting? Clara laughed. Only if you know more about flowers than Mr. Wilson. I definitely don't. The 3 of them shared an easy laugh. It was a simple moment. Ordinary. But somewhere deep inside Ethan's heart, something had quietly begun to change. And far away, inside a royal residence hidden beyond the forests of Alderheim, an elderly king unfolded a map of London, looked at a recent photograph of Clara, and whispered words that no one else could hear. My dear granddaughter. I hope he's worthy of the life you chose. Autumn arrived quietly, coloring London's tree-lined streets in shades of amber and gold. Over the past 2 months, Ethan and Clara had settled into an easy rhythm that neither of them had expected. What began as a professional arrangement had slowly grown into genuine friendship. They talked during long drives, not about billion-pound contracts or stock markets, but about favorite books, childhood dreams, forgotten cafes, and the ordinary moments that made life meaningful. One evening, after a successful meeting with government officials, Ethan glanced at his watch. I'm starving. Clara smiled. Congratulations. He laughed. I was hopping for a restaurant recommendation. There are dozens. I don't want dozens. He looked at her. I want your favorite. 20 minutes later, Clara parked outside a tiny family-owned cafe tucked away on a quiet side street. There were no photographers, no reserved tables, and certainly no famous guests. As they entered, the elderly owner beamed. "Clara." She embraced the old woman warmly. "It's been too long, Mrs. Bennet." Mrs. Bennet turned to Ethan with a mischievous smile. "So, you're the gentleman she keeps talking about." Clara's cheeks flushed. "I've mentioned him once." "Twice," Mrs. Bennet corrected with a wink. Ethan couldn't help laughing. Over homemade shepherd's pie and warm apple crumble, the conversation flowed effortlessly. "You know," Ethan said, "I've eaten in restaurants with Michelin stars all over Europe." And Clara asked, "This is better." Mrs. Bennet overheard him and proudly declared, "That's because love is the secret ingredient." The three of them laughed together. As they stepped outside, the distant bells of an old church began ringing across the neighborhood. The sound stopped Clara in her tracks. For an instant, the bustling London street disappeared. She was 9 years old again, standing inside the Royal Chapel of Alderheim. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows as choirs filled the air with hymns. Beside her stood her father, Prince Alexander, adjusting the tiny tiara on her head before whispering, "Never let the crown become heavier than your heart." The memory shifted. A black limousine. Flashing lights. Royal flags lowered to half-mast. Her mother's tearful face. Then, silence. Clara blinked. The flashback vanished. "Clara." Ethan's gentle voice brought her back. She realized she'd stopped walking. "You all right?" She forced a small smile. "Just remembering someone. Someone important. The most important." She said nothing more. Ethan didn't ask. But he noticed the sadness she couldn't quite hide. As they continued towards the car, neither of them realized they were being photographed from across the street. A man lowered his camera and immediately sent the images to Marcus Hale. Minutes later, Marcus studied the photographs in silence. Then his phone rang. His private investigator spoke quietly. "We've identified the crest on those sealed letters." Marcus's heartbeat slowed. "And it belongs to the Royal House of Alderheim." Marcus stared at Clara's smiling face in the photograph. For the first time in decades, a forgotten fear returned. He whispered to himself, "No, it can't be." Marcus Hale sat alone in his office long after the building had emptied. The city lights reflected across the glass walls as he stared at the investigator's report lying open before him. The blue wax seal, the crowned falcon crest, and the photographs of Clara outside the cafe pointed to one conclusion he had prayed never to see again. The Royal House of Alderheim. He poured himself a glass of water, but his hand trembled ever so slightly. A memory he had buried for 3 decades forced its way back. 30 years earlier, a much younger Marcus had stood in a grand palace ballroom during an international transport summit. Across the room, King Frederick had been speaking with William Blackwood, Ethan's father. The two men laughed like old friends while discussing a revolutionary infrastructure project that promised cleaner transport across Europe. Marcus had watched from a distance. Not with admiration. With envy. The flashback faded before revealing more, leaving only the uneasy feeling that something important had happened that night. Back in the present, Marcus slowly closed the file. "If she's really connected to them," he muttered, "this marriage can never happen." He immediately picked up his phone. "I want everything," he told the investigator. "Friends, relatives, schools, travel records. Find out who Clara Morgan really is." "We've already tried." "Try harder." After ending the call, Marcus opened a locked drawer. Inside lay an old newspaper clipping about William Blackwood's fatal car accident. He stared at it for several long seconds before locking the drawer again. "No," he whispered to himself. "Not again." Meanwhile, Ethan's feelings had become impossible to ignore. The following afternoon, after another successful meeting, he found Clara sitting alone in the company courtyard, quietly feeding breadcrumbs to a pair of pigeons. He sat beside her. "I've noticed something." She smiled. "Only one thing. You never pretend to be someone you're not." Clara laughed softly. "I could say the same about you." "I doubt that. You still carry your own coffee cup instead of asking someone else to do it." "You noticed." "I notice lots of things." He looked at her for a moment. What about me? She hesitated. I think you've spent so much of your life proving you're strong that you've forgotten it's all right to let people see when you're hurting. Her words landed with surprising force. Few people had ever spoken to him that honestly. Without thinking, Ethan asked quietly, "Would you have liked my father?" Clara looked into his eyes. "I think I would have respected him." "Why?" "Because the son he raised still believes kindness matters." Ethan looked away, overwhelmed by emotions he hadn't expected. Across the courtyard, Olivia watched the conversation from her office window. She smiled to herself. Whatever was growing between them wasn't built on wealth or status. It was something far rarer. But as Olivia turned back to her desk, another cream-colored envelope bearing the same royal blue wax seal had just arrived for Clara. This time, it carried a single handwritten sentence. "The time has come, you can no longer remain hidden." Clara's hands froze the moment she read it. For the first time since leaving the palace years ago, she wasn't sure her two worlds could stay apart much longer. Clara sat alone inside the executive car long after Ethan had gone into his penthouse. The letter rested in her hands. "The time has come, you can no longer remain hidden." She closed her eyes. For years, she had lived as Clara Morgan, not because she was ashamed of being Princess Clara Alexandra of Alderheim, but because she wanted to know whether people could love her without titles, ceremonies, or expectations. A quiet flashback surfaced. 7 years earlier. Inside the private library of Alderheim Palace, King Frederick had placed a passport and a simple set of car keys on the table. "If you leave," he had said gently, "you will leave as Clara Morgan, not as a princess." Young Clara had fought back tears. "What if people forget me?" The king smiled sadly. "Then they will remember the woman, not the crown. And if I find someone I love?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Tell him the truth before someone else does." The memory faded. Clara realized she had waited too long. The following evening, Ethan invited Clara to dinner on the rooftop garden of his penthouse. No reporters. No security. No luxury display. Just two people beneath a sky filled with stars. He poured 2 cups of tea instead of champagne. "I've been thinking," Ethan said. "That usually means something serious." He smiled. "It does." He reached across the table. "When you first became my driver, I admired your professionalism." She listened quietly. "Then I admired your kindness." His fingers gently found hers. "And somewhere along the way, I realized the happiest part of my day was simply sitting beside you." Clara's eyes filled with emotion. "Ethan, I love you." Silence surrounded them. For several heartbeats, neither of them spoke. Then Clara slowly withdrew her hand. "There are things about me you don't know. I don't need to know everything. You do." She stood and walked toward the edge of the terrace, looking out over London's lights. "I wasn't born into an ordinary family. I guessed as much." She turned. "My name isn't only Clara Morgan." A tear rolled down her cheek. "My full name is Princess Clara Alexandra Eleanor of Alderheim." The words hung in the air. Ethan stared at her, searching for any sign that she was joking. There was none. "My grandparents are the king and queen of Alderheim." He let out a slow breath. "So all those letters." She nodded. "The military training." Another nod. "The languages." "Everything." "And you became a driver, by choice." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted one part of my life to belong only to me. I wanted to know whether anyone would see me before they saw my title." She lowered her eyes. "I never meant to deceive you. Every day I wanted to tell you, and every day I became more afraid that I'd lose you." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Finally, he stood and walked towards her. She braced herself for him to leave. Instead, he gently took both of her hands. "When I met you, I didn't fall in love with a princess." He smiled through misty eyes. "I fell in love with the woman who stopped a £2.3 billion meeting to save a fruit seller." Another tear escaped Clara's eyes. "I fell in love with the woman children run towards, not away from." He laughed softly. And the woman who somehow convinced me that the best meal in London comes from a tiny family cafe. She laughed through her tears. So, he reached into his jacket. He wasn't holding a royal heirloom or a priceless family jewel. Just a simple engagement ring he had chosen weeks earlier. Princess or driver? He lowered himself onto one knee. Will you marry me? Clara covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. As they embraced beneath the stars, neither noticed a black luxury car parked across the street. Inside, Marcus Hale watched through tinted windows. His expression was colder than ever. He picked up his phone. So it's true, he said quietly. She's the princess. A voice answered. What do we do now? Marcus looked at an old photograph of William Blackwood hidden inside his briefcase. His jaw tightened. We make sure. They never reached the altar. He ended the call. Far away in Alderheim Palace, King Frederick stood beside his study window, looking at a framed photograph of Clara as a little girl sitting behind the steering wheel of her father's vintage car, laughing as he taught her how to drive. The king smiled. She's finally found the man who sees her heart. He had no idea that before their wedding day arrived, a 30-year-old secret buried with Ethan's father would rise from the past. And when a billionaire finally married the driver who was secretly a princess, the ceremony would become the moment that exposed a conspiracy someone had spent decades trying to keep hidden.